It's really good to see you again, actually. It's been a little while since we've spoken.
Has.
We did a little bit of work together. I'm not going to go into the details of what it was, but we did a little bit of work together, and it was really enjoyable. And in fact, you had a radio show. What's happened to that radio show? Are you still doing it?
Well, I will be coming back soon. They cleared us to go into the studio once we've gone through all the cleaning processes and that. Yes, so the next few weeks.
Oh, excellent. Okay, well, let me know. And I can put a link on the YouTube channel. What I should say as a little bit of an introduction, really, is that you have this scientific approach to life, but you also are open-minded about some of the other aspects to this experience of being a human being, of living in this reality. So, could you just give us a little bit of background? About a little bit about you, if possible, and obviously.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I actually did my degree in physics a bit later on. I love physics, but when I left school, I didn't want to go straight into college. So I actually worked offshore for a couple of years and did some other jobs on oil rigs and that sort of thing. And then when my first son was born, this is a long time ago, back in the 70s, I went back to up in Aberdeen, up in Scotland, where I was living at that time. I was actually living out in the countryside, and then doing 2 weeks offshore, 2 weeks on. But I went to college up there and did a degree in physics. And then I did go into engineering, but I was also at the same time taking a course in theoretical physics at Birkbeck College at London University, where David Bohm taught, who's the quantum theorist. And so I got very interested in his view of quantum theory. And of course, he was very interested in talking to people like Krishnamurti and that about the spiritual aspects of life. So it was a path of physics, and then I read Capra's book, Tao of Physics. So I got involved in physics, and it's actually physics and knowing David Bohm that sort of brought me into the more spiritual side of life. And so I got very interested in Zen and that type of thing. But I kept my feet on the ground by doing a lot of sort of engineering. I was involved in electronics and software and things like that. And now I do AI and machine learning, data science. But physics is my real love. But physics combined with spirituality, I think. Those two things, mind and matter, if you like it, however you want to describe them.
So the book by the Tao of Physics, wasn't it? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that was Fritjof Capra.
Yeah, that's
Tao
it.
of Physics. And he actually mentioned David Bohm in that book, and that's how I thought I'd get in touch with David, and I did, and went along and took his course.
There's been a lot of concentration in physics over the issues of trying to evaluate what consciousness is, which really ties into our outlook of spirituality, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, my first sort of introduction to that was with Roger Penrose. I became very interested in Roger Penrose's work on how consciousness and reality are sort of combined. In other words, how consciousness is a fundamental part of reality, basically. And his theory is that basically consciousness, the wave function, due to the energy of in our brains, if you like. So we actually create reality in every moment with our minds. That would be a very, very, very brief overview of his ideas. I mean, he's written 2 big books about it, and but also Henry Stapp, of course, who's another brilliant physicist from Berkeley University in United States. So I kept very much in touch with how quantum theorists were trying to somehow, and of course it all started with von Neumann, who realized that the collapse of the wave function basically occurs in your mind, in the brain. He did a lot of mathematics to sort of show that. So I've always been interested in that aspect of the philosophical, the ontological side of quantum theory, and try to maintain that sort of line with all the different ideas that are coming through and all the different experiments. So I've tried to sort of always keep those 2 things in mind, consciousness. And I actually went into, I've worked I still work in the psychiatry department at a hospital in the United States, where I do sort of neuroscience and AI and all that sort of thing, deep learning. So I love this sort of interface between the physics of the brain and the spirituality of the brain. And basically, it all comes down to consciousness. consciousness is a fundamental aspect. As Max Planck said, who was one of the fathers of quantum theory, consciousness is the fundamental thing in the universe. It actually creates matter, basically. Consciousness is the underlying foundation of the universe. And I believe that as well. And yes, there have been many developments going along. But really, we're still, I think, at that stage where the scientific world still, separates the observer and the observed. And yet, everything in spirituality and everything I sort of come across in neuroscience doesn't see that boundary anymore. That boundary is sort of disappearing. But conventional science hasn't accepted that yet. So we're at that point where there's going to be some sort of revolution, and people have been saying that for many years. So in some sense, science hasn't really changed a whole lot since quantum theory came along, special relativity and general relativity. We're still trying to figure out what they all mean, basically.
Quantum theory really came to the fore almost 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago, didn't it?
Yeah, over 100 years ago. Yeah, it was around about the turn of the century when Max Planck started, his idea that the vibrations, the energetic vibrations in a material are quantized. There's so many different. There's so many different, really brilliant. Some of these theories are really brilliant. Actually, brilliant people that create these, but they're theories. There's so many really good ones out there at the moment. But it all comes down to basically, explaining that collapse. And Penrose, says it happens in the brain.
Just to be clear, sorry to interrupt your flow, but just to be clear, because the importance of the collapse of the wave function, as it's described, is actually that conversion from possibility into actuality. That's the essence of it, isn't it? And yes. So what the bottom line is that most theories say that there has to be an observer in order for that wave function to collapse, and therefore a lot of lay people, including myself, I suppose, say, well, yes, obviously, as the human being goes through time, then that, as you say, Penrose is saying that collapsing is occurring within the brain or within the body. Well, he probably says brain.
Brain. It's a little technical. It's the microtubules. Stuart Hameroff sort of came up with that. It's the microtubules, and it's a long and detailed story. I don't want to minimize the amount of complexity in it. So
no, that's fine, because so broadly speaking, in terms of spirituality, slash consciousness, we are, as human beings, we're conscious human beings. And we are able to use our awareness to basically move our way through what we regard as a tangible exterior environment. There's been so much written in New Age press, etc., about the fact that we create our reality, quote unquote, which is all based upon the concept of the observer collapsing the wave function in quantum physics. That principle, that the observer, human being, potentially collapses the wave function and therefore their reality is formed around them, is that one way then that it could actually be happening around us, that this reality is being collapsed all the time by our awareness, our consciousness within the brain?
Well, I would say, first of all, as a scientist, you've got to be very careful. And as Ken Wilber points out, who's a great philosopher and everything, is that quantum theory is just a bunch of symbols on a piece of paper. And it doesn't have any formal interpretation. It's just a mathematical formalism. So you've got to be careful with that, first off. And as a scientist, really, science can't really talk about consciousness very much because we don't understand what consciousness is. However, I would say that the question is wrong in some way, because it presupposes, if you're talking about metaphysics here, it presupposes that consciousness is in our brain and that there's an inside and outside, that there's a brain and then there's a reality outside the brain, as you know. So really, that's the problem, this object-subject dichotomy. This creates the problems that we have with quantum theory. But really, when it comes down to it, and a lot of people who've taken psychedelic drugs, and a lot of people who are spiritual and everything have experienced this. I've experienced it as well through meditation, that there is no inside and outside. There is no in here, the brain collapsing the reality out there. There's just one. There's just one consciousness. So that's from a metaphysics point of view. However, from a neuroscience point of view, I will say that I was watching a video by, I think it's Anil Seth, or is it Seth Anil? I can't remember. I think it's Anil Seth. He's a neuroscientist. And he goes through, there's a little YouTube he does on it. And he's a strong scientific neuroscientist. He said, basically, we do hallucinate our reality. He says it's only because we all agree that on the same hallucination that we say it's not a hallucination, we call it reality. And if you look at Piaget's work as well, about how the child develops, when we first start off as newborn babies, well, there's only complete wholeness. There's no separateness. And gradually as we develop, as the brain develops, we start separating out relative invariance in what we see as something. We see it as the same as us, but gradually, due to parental, I'd say, interference, or saying the parents saying, "Here's a rattle," and that all these incredible experiences we're having as a baby start crystallizing out, and gradually we start seeing this invariant fluctuations in the wholeness as being separate to us, and gradually we start developing the idea of object. And of course, once you've got an object, you have to have a container to put it in. So we gradually develop this idea of space and time and ego gradually. And there's this whole progression of how we develop ourselves as separate beings from out there. And Piaget talks about this a lot, and Einstein was interested in his ideas as well. So I think that as a scientist, you've got to be really careful, because to me, science is all about just creating models of reality. And models are only approximations to reality. So that's why science and spirituality don't really get along, because they talk in different ways. They have a different paradigm. They have a different just whole structure about understanding reality. So understanding reality, you can understand reality from a scientific point of view by measuring things and coming up with models to explain observations and repeatability. On the other hand, spirituality, it's experience. But science can't really talk about experience very much, because we don't even understand what an experience is. So the two things, and Sir Arthur Eddington, the great astronomer and physicist, he was a Quaker. He said that he could live with that. The two things are separate, but they're complementary. They're just different ways. Science doesn't have a monopoly on understanding reality. It's one way of understanding reality. Spirituality is another understanding. Alan Watts said there's actually no such thing as spirituality, the spirit world or the physical world. There just is. But science is one way of looking at that, and religion and spirituality is another way. But they complement each other, I think. And I can't remember if I've answered your question after all that.
It's fine. What you said was absolutely great. That's absolutely wonderful. Do you think that there is a danger that scientific thinking railroads a lot of other thinking? And I'm thinking. Go on. You were going to say.
Yeah. Science. What is science? You see, there's no actual strict definition of science. So a lot of scientists don't actually understand the underlying philosophy of science. This is the problem. So some scientists, that belong to Skeptical Inquirer and everything, they think that to be skeptical means to just poo-poo everything, basically, and that's not what skepticism actually is. It's just having an open mind and making sure you think about things and test things. So it depends on what sort of scientist you are. As I was saying, Max Planck, a brilliant physicist, in the end decided that consciousness was the fundamental thing in the universe. Everything else was created out of consciousness. And this was the person who came up with basically quantum theory. And this was in his later days when he wrote about this. Many scientists come up with that. In fact, Ken Wilber's written a book about called Quantum Questions, I think it is, and he says that most of the physicists who worked in quantum theory were actually great believers in a spiritual world. I mean, Schrödinger was a Vedantic. Bohr was a Taoist. Heisenberg sort of came to philosophy a little late. He was more of an operationist. Operationalist. In other words, he just did the mathematics and didn't worry about what they meant. Bohm was, of course, very spiritual in nature as well. Most of these physicists but they didn't become that way because of quantum theory, apparently. If you look at their work, as Ken Wilber went through and looked at it, they actually had this attitude before they started work, most of them anyway, before they started working in the quantum realm. So quantum theory didn't actually change their minds. They actually had this sort of outlook anyway. So they were scientists that could have open minds about things and look at different possibilities. Now, there's some scientists, particularly, I have to say, particularly neuroscientists and particularly people in the biological field, who are still very stuck in the classical view of reality. They still can't get their heads around this alternative quantum idea. And it's because they're coming at it from a more sort of rigorous classical view of what, there's an observer and an observed and that sort of thing. So it depends on your outlook. It also depends on the type of physicist you are from a philosophical point of view. So Einstein was actually what's called a critical was actually called a realist, because he believed that there was an observer and an observed. However, he agreed that what we actually perceive is not necessarily what is actually out there. And that's called, one form of that is called critical realism. So he's a critical realist and he had a very open mind about things. But he did believe strongly that there was an inside and outside sort of thing. Now, Penrose, on the other hand, is actually a Platonist. He believes that the mathematics, the universe basically mathematics basically drives the universe, and that there is a Platonic world from which everything is created. So he's a Platonist. Hawking, who he used to work with, is a positivist. A positivist, which comes from the logical positivists and that of, and actually goes all the way back to Sir William of Ockham, Occam's razor, believes that really you can only talk about what you perceive. That's all. You can't know beyond that. What's only available to your senses, basically, don't make assumptions beyond that. So just talk about what you can perceive. Basically, that's the basic form of positivism. So he says, beyond what we can make out from our perceptions, we can form models and that about that, is what science does. Anything beyond that is metaphysics. Anything beyond what our senses can perceive and make of is metaphysics. So he doesn't say what reality is. He just says what reality is related to what we can observe, basically. So that's positivism. So positivists really shouldn't have, a strong positivist shouldn't really have any view of what reality actually is. They're just building better and better models to fit with the observations. So in that case, science doesn't really talk about what reality is at all, in the strictest sense. Although some scientists, don't really understand what they're talking about when they talk about models. So there's a whole range of what scientists, the type of science, and then there's idealism, of course, from George Berkeley, which is really not in science. So there's realism, critical, there's a whole variety, there's a whole spectrum of ideas, going from we just make models and they're approximations to reality, all the way down to some people still think that science actually talks about how reality actually is. What actually science does, the great thing about science that is often missed, is that actually science really does a great job on telling you how reality actually isn't. It actually, because of the process of science, forming hypotheses and testing them and rejecting or accepting, continually testing, it's always telling you how reality isn't. Like, reality is not classical, like classical mechanics. So it's brilliant at doing that. And that's a part of science that's often missed out. That's the beauty of science in my mind. There's a great way of saying what isn't, but how it actually is, we actually can't say. So to go back and answer your question after having said that, basically, science really can't tell us how reality is. It can point to it, and sort of like with quantum entanglement, it can say, hey, it's definitely not classical. These things, we don't know what the hell it means. We've no idea, but it's certainly there's something going on that seems to think everything's connected beyond space and time. And then philosophers come in and ask brilliant questions. That's what philosophers do. Philosophers are not so great at answering those questions sometimes. We leave that up to scientists. So it's sort of that, and that's the murkiness of science, and that's why it should be murky. You know, there's this to and fro, and it just progresses along. And, you know, so I think that's why we're at that point where it's going to take a long time to people to accept that consciousness is a fundamental aspect. Now, I have to just put the caveat in here that our consciousness, this is why I often think about aliens visiting this planet. And people say, oh, aliens visit our planet and they're, you know, they're like us, little green men or whatever, you know, the greys and that sort of thing. Personally, I think that there isn't just one reality. I think that our brains, if you like, are like the, you know, restricting valves. They abstract one form of reality. And yet there's beings out there that can abstract and understand reality in a totally different way, beyond space and time. They might not even have any concept of space and time, yet they exist throughout the universe and stuff, but they're abstracting a different reality out of, you can say, coming out of the quantum field, whatever you want to say, or the holographic universe. So there isn't just one reality either, I don't think. I think it's far, far more complex than we think. Our view of the universe as this physical sort of space-time thing, which we know space and time are not absolutes anyway, is just one way of looking at the universe, and a very small way of looking at the universe.
That's very much food for thought, to say the least. The concept of the different realities, the different access, the ability of an organism or a conscious being to actually access different aspects and have different rules for their reality, which is really
well, think about an amoeba, which is a basic cell. It has some form of reality for itself. It's not, you know, let's say at some points, you know, as we go up the animals, consciousness forms, right? Maybe every particle has consciousness. I mean, Whitehead, with his process philosophy, said even a particle has a consciousness. It's the becoming of the entire universe. It's, you know, his whole process reality idea. So, you know, even that little amoeba has extracted some reality. It probably has no concept of space and time. In fact, if we didn't have vision, if you think about it, if we just listening, if you listen to a sound going by, like a motorbike goes by, the motorbike doesn't make that noise at all. The motorbike makes no noise. It produces, let's say from a physics point of view, it produces sound waves, which from a physics point of view hit our eardrum, but it's our brain that create that experience. The motorbike doesn't make any sound. There's no smell in the world. The universe has no smell. We create smell by absorbing these molecules and creating this sensation of smell. So from the point of view of smell, there's no such thing as smell, but the brain creates an interpretation of it. So we get an experience of it. From the sound coming into your ear, the brain takes what we think is outside, at least, let's say from a scientific point of view, and creates sensation of a noise. From the eye's point of view, the eyes take this whole input of information, which all is on the surface. It actually forms a hologram on the surface of your eye, actually. And it abstracts from a two-dimensional layer of information. The eye creates a representation of that information to its best ability, combined with the other senses, of space and time, actually. It also integrates it with time. So it's just a representation. This is what Donald Hoffman talks about a lot as well, that it creates a representation in the brain that really has which is only one way of looking at it. That is a consistent, the brain forms hypotheses about reality all the time. They're just models of reality, if you want to think from a scientific point of view. But they're not the real reality. So even space and time is just just like the noise of a motorbike going past is a pure creation in the brain. Our vision, our space and time representation of what we think reality is the pure creation in the brain. Everything we experience we only experience in the brain. That's it.
So the fundamental question that leads to, for me, anyway, the obvious question that leads to for me is, therefore, individual people's interpretation of the world that they experience must differ quite vastly. Because a break, you know, the amount of processing that's going on within the body as a processing unit. If you think about individual human beings simply as a processing unit, coming up with hypotheses about what the environment is that they are supposedly separate from, there's so much scope for variation.
Right, but you're still thinking. You're still thinking in a space-time framework.
Aren't I?
You see, that's the problem. All brains are connected. We're all aspects of the same hologram, if you want to think about it like that. So if you have a hologram, you know, if you break off a little film or a piece of the hologram film, you shine light, you get the whole image. Each little piece of the hologram, let's say each little piece we can break off a hologram is a separate consciousness, but we're all part of that one consciousness. So we all view it like a mountain has many sides. We can view it from different sides. We're all viewing the same mountain. We might have different views of that mountain. We might have different views of the hologram. So it's the Eastern religious thing about the 10,000 jewels. You know, the 10,000 jewels in Eastern philosophy is, when they talk about 10,000 things in Eastern philosophy, they mean everything. Basically, it's 10,000 was a big number back then. That if you shine a light, if the light goes into a room of 10,000 jewels in there, you see everything, because everything's reflected off everything. So when they talk about the universe being like 10,000 jewels, it's like a hologram, that every part of the universe contains every other part. So like a holographic film, every little piece of that holographic film contains all the information. And it's like our eyes, as Carl Pribram, the neuroscientist, to a neurosurgeon who's written many articles on this, you know, there's a YouTube video of him showing that if you take the lens off a projector, so you're saying, you remember slide projectors in those days, you take the lens off, you just see a blur. But the information from that slide that's been projected there is on that film. He says it's what's it called, a spread function in mathematics. Every piece of that projection screen contains information in the whole image that's being projected. Now you take the lens off, right? So he holds up his glasses, his reading glasses, to the thing, and it's a brilliant YouTube video out there. You can find it, and instantly two images form on the screen, because his glasses are now taking all the information coming from that image and focusing it. So now you don't have a spread function, you have a one-to-one correspondence between the slide, information on the slide, and information on the screen. That's exactly what our eyes do. Our eyes are a Fourier transform. They go from, because think about your eyes, the surface, if you had a little bit of photographic film and you put it over your lens here, and you were to have a shutter that just went down quickly, very quickly, fast as you like, not an opening, not an aperture, but a shutter. And then you looked at that thing. Would you see an image on the film that was right above your eye? No, you'd see a blur, because on your eye surface, all the light, thinking from a physics point of view, all the light from every region you're looking at is coming and hitting, and you're getting a superposition of all the light coming from every region you're looking at in space, right? And time, actually. And so on the surface of your eye, like the little film I was talking about, the shutter thing, you see a blur if you looked at that, and that's because it's a hologram. There's a hologram actually on your eye, forms all the time in a two-dimensional surface. And so what the eye does, the brilliant thing of the eye, this little hole, and this is the whole thing with a pinhole camera, and you can get a piece of card and you punch a little hole in it. And if you had a big hole, you just see a blur of light coming through. If you punch a little hole, hold it up to a projector thing, you see an image, just a hole. A lens does the same thing. So the hole in your eye, what it does, it converts a hologram into a space, and let's say just space representation on the back of your retina. Because what it does a one-to-one correspondence between what you see in your retina and what is supposedly out there. Now you could say that it's abstracting some information from the world outside. And actually David Bohm pointed this out. He said if it wasn't for lenses like in our eye and for telescopes and things like that, we wouldn't see the universe we see it. We'd see it holistically. But we've evolved to see it in terms of space and then time, because without time, you can't have space, and without space, you can't have time. They're two complementary things. You can't have one without the other, basically. so even he said that had we evolved differently and we had diffraction gratings instead of holes, we'd have seen we'd be living in what's called the frequency domain rather than the space-time domain. There's a thing in physics where you can go from the space-time domain to the frequency domain, vice versa, called a Fourier transform. And our brains actually, and Carl Pribram pointed out, in our brains we actually store information in the frequency domain. A lot of the brain does, and then when we want to recall something or bring something out, it actually it unfolds it into a space-time domain. So our heads are actually, we don't really, so we really have this bubble reality on our heads, which is actually all in here, but we project it outwards. So anyway, so that's the idea that there is actually a holistic universe out there, but our senses, and remember, the universe comes as a whole. It comes as a whole, as a hologram, and we actually, out of our senses, create a space-time out of it. It's actually holistic, but we're like little antennas that absorb the wholeness, and then we create space and time out of it. And that's one of the most recent ideas, actually, in physics, the holographic, not the Bohm holographic model, but the one, what's his name, Seth, can't remember his second name, sorry. That actually, this comes from black hole theory, that actually reality is actually a two-dimensional surface inside a black hole. Information, when it goes into a black hole, is actually plastered around the surface as a hologram, inside surface of a black hole. And so some people think the universe is actually one big black hole, and that the actual information is around this inside surface of the universe, and it's projected in as a three-dimensional reality. So it's sort of consistent with that in some ways.
Yeah, we're going to stop recording fairly soon because there's so much and so many questions. And well, actually, do you know what it is, Ian? There's so much that you said that I actually want to think about. I actually want to think about what it is
a lot
that you said, because it's extraordinary. You see, I probably oversimplify things in an effort to try to understand them. And well, bottom line, let's just bring this back to the main thrust of the YouTube channel, which is really about how do we improve our well-being, and we're talking today because we're looking at the logical scientific side of the sort of metaphysics, which is obviously really what I'm involved in, is, as you know, that spiritual metaphysical side of life, not the scientific, but I find the scientific fascinating, and I'm always looking to see how science is, where is the merger, what are they doing together, and where's the overlap. And what you've done today is actually you've helped clarify in my mind some of the differences, and also some of the strengths of the two aspects of the way of looking at the world. You've also made it very clear that you can never really be completely embracing science and spirituality, although you do seem to do a damn good job of doing that. I think
I disagree. I disagree with that. I think they're complementary views of the universe, and so yes, one really can't talk about the other. Yet together you can get, and this is what William Blake's whole thing was about. You have to, as a human being, bring the rational and the spiritual together in some form. And the two together, actually, one without the other is like a man without a wife or a wife without a man. I don't know, but the two complement each other, and they're just different. And it's like, we come across these paradoxes all the time in life, that we have to live with these things, that they're just different ways of understanding whatever reality is. There's no one way of understanding it. It's the best we can do.